Let me ask something, because as you know, more or less, the program is the following. Sot Barber speaks like for up to 30 minutes, then Jim Fleming speaks up to 10 minutes. Roberto has to leave before the 40 minutes. So if you have already something that you know that you can ask, go ahead and ask it.
I prefer to listen.
Okay.
Well, you should go before I do.
Okay, let's do that.
Oh, I see. Okay, so you want me to answer Roberto right now?
No, well, but so do you already know what you are going to answer to him?
Okay, I can give you a short answer now, Roberto, and then I will elaborate it in. It will be a little longer from the talk that I give, which I will type up and email to you and to other participants, since I'm departing from my prepared text, so to speak. But your question was, how is it that after 200 years we are still debating the question of what the American Constitution means? Now, the debate, the interpretive debate in the United States has several strands. One of them, the most contentious one and the most long-standing one, is the debate concerning the scope of the power of the national government vis-a-vis the states. That debate is actually still going on. The roots of that debate lie in cultural, sectional, economic, and racial divisions in America. The debate over originalism is, as Jim describes it. Now, that may change in light of what Larry said this morning, but the debate over originalism is, safe to say, a post-war development. I think the debate continues. My own view is the debate continues because many people are unprepared to go where the evidence and the argument leads. The evidence and the argument leads actually to some pretty dramatic places, and maybe that's why they're reluctant to go there. It will change our understanding of democracy, for example. It will change our understanding of the rule of law. And most fundamentally, it will change our established understanding. When I say our established understanding, I mean our established understanding in the social sciences and in academic law, not our established understanding on the streets. It will change our established understanding of the nature of values. I think that's the most important change. Now, academics are like everybody else. They make investments, and they want to protect those investments, even if they've made their investments in errors or mistakes of one kind or another. And that, frankly, is what I believe is going on among those intellectuals who, to whom it has been demonstrated that originalism is an indefensible position, and yet they persist in it. I will give you a more detailed answer in my email to you, Roberto. Thank you very much.
So you keep going for
You want me to start now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And we'll move from there.
Now, my thanks to Emer and Jim for inviting me to take part in this intellectually challenging send-off to what promises to be a major contribution to the interpretive debate. Though I'm confident that Jim's book will change many minds, I won't predict that the book will be a game changer, because no book can persuade those who won't be persuaded. And as I suggested yesterday, and as I suggested in my answer to Roberto this morning, one must look to influences beyond evidence and logic to explain originalism's survival as a force in legal academe. I want to save maximum time for discussion, so I'll be brief. As I said in my draft remarks, the ones from which I am departing, The moral reading presupposes the possibility of moral truth. And it is that possibility which originalism denies. This denial is incoherent. As Jim says, originalism is an ism. It purports to reason from a true conception of a contested normative concept, namely democracy, even as it denies the possibility of moral truth. Now, as much as I admire Jim's achievement, I have three reservations about his book. First of all, I think Jim is overly charitable toward originalists like Larry Solom and Jack Balkin. Originalism has practical implications, not the least of which are the messages it sends to future lawyers and judges. One of these messages is that law is grounded not in reason, but in preference and will. Another message is that democracy can't institutionalize a concern for improving the moral character of legal decision and ultimately the moral character of its people. I'll get into that a little later. This may be a message that some people want to hear because it licenses a willfulness and a self-indulgence that a commercial society promotes. A willfulness and a self-indulgence that has brought the United States and much of the world to a point of irreversible decline. It's not a message to convey, however, unless the evidence compels us to, and the evidence doesn't compel us to. Quite the opposite, in fact. My second and related reservation is Jim's belief that we should be faithful to an imperfect Constitution. I doubt that this position is consistent with Jim's view of the Constitution as an instrument of preambular aspirations. Larry Sager suggested yesterday that our constitutional practice represents a sustained effort to be the best version of ourselves as a people. I think Larry is right. That Larry is right can be shown in two ways. It can be shown in both an originalist fashion, and it can be shown to be true as a matter of practical reason, or, if you prefer, constitutional logic. For the originalist argument in behalf of Larry's position, you might take a look at the chapter on the Federalist Papers in the book that Jim and I published with Oxford in 2007, Constitutional Interpretation, The Basic Questions. For the logic of the matter, consider the following 5 theses. Thesis number 1. Constitutional text and history display the Constitution, display the American Constitution, as essentially a set of institutional means to preambular ends like justice, the common defense, and the general welfare. For originalist confirmation of this point, you might take a look at the Federalist Papers as a whole, especially papers number 1 and 45. The second thesis is that means to ends, are essentially contingent and therefore defeasible. The Constitution recognizes this principle by providing for amendments in, of course, Article 5. The third thesis has to do with Article 5. As it turns out, Article 5 is merely a rule, and in addition, it is part of a set of constitutional means. Article 5 is therefore defeasible. That is to say, one can rationally bypass Article 5 when Article 5 fails to be what it should be, a workable rule. For originalist confirmation of this thesis, you can check out Madison's argument in the Federalist number 40. At the end of the day, I think you will conclude that the Constitution's one indefeasible commitment is to what Alexander Hamilton identified as the founding generation's distinctive ambition, namely, to prove to humankind the possibility of good government by reflection and choice. Thesis number 5. Reflection and choice are practical human processes, and as such, they presuppose two things. They presuppose an end, and they presuppose an agent. They presuppose an end at the end of the process, and they presuppose an agent that employs the process in pursuit of the end. The end can only be a public good, most comprehensively, the good and just society. In the end, that end can be approximated only by a competent and public-spirited leadership community that enjoys the public's trust. I'll repeat that. In the end, the Constitution's one indefeasible commitment, namely to prove the possibility of government by reflection and choice, can be approximated only by a competent and public-spirited leadership community that enjoys the public's trust. For confirmation of that thesis, for originalist confirmation of that thesis, consult Madison's argument in the Federalist number 40. This state of affairs, a competent and public-spirited leadership community that enjoys the public's trust, this state of affairs is the best that we can hope to be in a world of contingencies that makes ends like perfect justice, security, and the like objects just beyond our grasp, objects of continuing aspiration. The aim of the Constitution and all man-made constitutions that seek secular ends and recognize the principle of amendability thus implies what Larry suggested yesterday, a project of making the people the best that it can be. Now, in addition, I also have reservations about Jim's view of constitutional failure, but I won't repeat what I say in my draft comments. Once again, I want to save maximum time for discussion, so my thanks to Emer for a most edifying and enjoyable 2 days, and my congratulations to Jim for an important intellectual achievement and a contribution to constitutionalism itself, namely the prospect of government, good government by reflection and choice.
Thank you. Te iba a preguntar, Roberto, si querías hacer una pregunta o algún comentario mayor. Okay. I think Roberto seems to he liked your reply, your comment on what you were asking. The explanation seems to he agree completely. And I would like just to point to part of that source also. You didn't use the word, but I would like to use the word traditions. As an outsider to the American constitutional debates, but I am close enough to, I can tell that there are very different things that you will always have the feeling that, well, you probably have to get rid of these or lower them or tamper with them or something like that. And then you realize, well, there's a tradition behind that it makes it really hard to give up. So, for instance, the Electoral College, and there might be reforms on that, but you usually don't get more than saying that. The fact that the Supreme Courts are appointed for lifetime, and I remember Ronnie Dworkin on the Is Democracy Possible saying, well, let's do 15-year terms. And of course, I also like one thing that he did say in that proposal was that, and of course, this cannot apply to the justices already in the court. This will apply to those coming after. So he will not be violating the ex post facto principle and throwing people out after. So I think and those are probably the two that come to mind to say why, besides this, you pointed more to the ideological debate. And of course, behind this tradition, I can see there's still, and I think that ties nice, I think, with Ken's paper on the conservative part of, and tradition, so is pretty much the flag and the crest for this troop. Wanted to keep that. So, but I wanted just to complement with your comment with this, and I guess we can give the floor to Jim Fleming to comment or reply.
Okay. Well, I appreciate the comments. I appreciate the comments from my most esteemed co-author, and perhaps I erred in not asking him to join me in this book to save me from error. And I also take very seriously any reservations that you might have about the project. Let me respond briefly to each of the three reservations. First, that I'm overly charitable toward originalists like Larry Solomon, Jack Bach. And I appreciate hearing that today and at this conference, given some of the criticisms Larry has raised. But you put it in your written remarks that I try to save them from themselves. And to this, I plead guilty. I am irredeemably constructive. I am irredeemably concerned to find and build upon common ground. And as I thought about the tradition of originalism, after so much of the highly moralistic, condemnatory, exclusivist tropes within originalism, I really appreciated what I took to be the inclusiveness of Larry's conception of originalism and of Jack Balkin's conception. And I took it that they, in the things they said about the Constitution's commitments, and here I think I can speak more confidently about Jack than Larry. I'm going to have to go back and rethink what I've said about Larry, but in Jack's characterization of the original public meaning as of the Constitution, or his characterization of the character of some of our commitments being abstract moral principles, I thought there was a lot of room there to find common ground and to show that Jack, at least, was open to a moral reading. And in fact, the best way to understand what he was doing was to understand it as a moral reading. Now, I acknowledge that he had all of these postmodernist tendencies that would understandably make him reluctant to sign up with that project, but I nonetheless thought it was an accurate understanding of what it is that he is doing. And so even if in the end you can't save him from his postmodernism that leads him to talk about faith in a way that would trouble Dick Fallon and that ultimately would trouble me too, I do think that there's plenty of room there to try to work with them and to build upon and incorporate some of the, I think, really brilliant observations about our constitutional practice that he makes. Now, on the second reservation, my belief that we should be faithful to an imperfect Constitution. I think what I've been saying in response to that is basically a reprise of what I said in response to Larry Sager yesterday, who had a similar reservation. I think it's very important that liberal constitutional theorists who care about fit with the Constitution and who care about fidelity to the Constitution face up to the perfect Constitution challenge. Now, the Henry Monahan Perfect Constitution Challenge. Now, I concluded my first book, Securing Constitutional Democracy, with a full chapter responding to that challenge. And, you know, Chris Eisgruber very cleverly framed it as a no pain, no claim test. And he said folks like you conceived the test as a no gain, no claim test. And I certainly, in that book, closed by endorsing the no gain, no claim test, that a constitutional theory has no hold on us unless it, you know, promises to help us attain our best selves, as you put it now. But I do think it's important to recognize the fallibility of the Constitution, some of the moral shortfall of the Constitution, and face up to the challenge that we're just reading a liberal, perfect Constitution into the Constitution. And I do think, you know, if you seek constitutional theorists who are critical of the existing state of affairs in American constitutional life, you need seek no further than Ronald Dworkin's book, than your book on constitutional failure. What I'm getting at is that the so-called proponents of the perfect liberal constitution are actually quite critical of the existing state of affairs in constitutional practice. I think it's important to recognize that, but also to think about what is the best we can do going forward given that state of affairs. And in the closing chapter of my book, I argue that, well, instead of rewriting the Constitution, either through constitutional convention or through particular amendments, we should, at first blush at least, strive to bring an attitude of fidelity toward our imperfect Constitution, do the best we can, rewrite not the Constitution but the constitutional culture, and there I think we have affinities. And you, in the closing pages of your book on constitutional failure, do cite Linda's and my book, Ordered Liberty, where we do talk about the importance of inculcating civic virtues and the capacities for democratic and personal self-government and the like. So in the end, I don't think we're all that different there, other than that if I'm incurably constructive, I suppose I'm incurably optimistic, and you're not. So that, I think, accounts for the. I think it's more of a temperamental difference than a theoretical difference. Although I realize that some of my discussion on constitutional failure in that final chapter will sound too lawyerly and formalistic for you, and to that I plead guilty. I do want to distinguish various types of failure: moral failure, institutional failure, political failure, failure of policy. All of that isn't necessarily constitutional failure. And I think a lot of the failure in our polity today is of those sort. Okay? Now, finally, so I guess I have responded to all three of your reservations. Thank you for those. Thank you for the support, but also thank you for the criticism. And I think I may have to tweak a few phrases to make a few things clearer. Okay.
Well, let me just respond very briefly only to what you said at the end. As far as the other matters are concerned, I think it is largely a matter of temperament and optimism. You're younger than I am, so you can afford to be optimistic. Maybe my pessimism reflects my age, but I am most definitely pessimistic for sure. But with regard to your distinction, my reservation about the concluding section of your book is I really don't know where you stand with regard to constitutional failure, because you seem at different parts of the argument, as I said in my prepared remarks, you seem in different parts of your argument to assert two contradictory positions, positions that contradict each other. One position is the causal theory of constitutional failure, as I indicate in my prepared remarks. The other one is the instrumental theory of constitutional failure. And I think the first thing you need to do is clarify your position so that it won't cause confusion in the minds of readers like me. Secondly, I think that if you follow now what Sager said yesterday, I think is very important, perhaps more important than meets the eye, perhaps far more important than meets the eye. Sager said yesterday that our constitutional practice leads to a certain conclusion. I sketched an argument just now, and I'll send out my remarks later, that it's not just our constitutional practice that leads to this conclusion, but constitutional logic leads to this conclusion. Now, if this conclusion is correct, and I think it is, if this conclusion is correct, then the decisive constitutional failure is an attitudinal, or if you will, a moral failure. And therefore, you can't really make a distinction between institutional failure and moral failure, because it is moral failure that lies behind and lies at the roots of institutional failure. But that's just something that we may just disagree. But before you reject that, just take a look at what I send out so that you can think about the logic of the matter. Yeah, thank you, Jim.
Questions? Ken Kima? There's a microphone here, Jim. Can you put the mic?
This is a peripheral point. I don't think anything. This is a response to a peripheral point that I think. Excuse me. I'm sorry. What I'm going to comment on is, I think, inessential to your argument. It doesn't really figure in any important way to your argument. So it's a peripheral comment, but it might be a little long-winded. When you said that originalists don't believe in moral truth, that simply can't be right. And here's the reason. You know, the arguments that people give in favor of originalism are moral arguments. The question is always, what is the morally legitimate way to interpret the Constitution? Now, I don't know the exact history of how the framers arrived at the ideas they arrived at, but one thing I've noticed is that our Constitution and the way we put it together and ratified it mirrors John Locke's social contract theory justification of the legitimacy of government. Here's how it worked for Locke. If you can show, right, the fundamental problem is this. You know, how can we justify the laws telling us what to do and backing it up with the threat of force? That's like a robber. Nobody gets to do that. So you need to tell some kind of moral story that distinguishes the state, which looks like a big-ass robber, from robbers. I mean, I'm way more afraid of the state than I am of robbers, because they're the ones with the nukes and tanks and all of that. A robber might have a handgun, but I'd rather deal with somebody with a handgun than somebody with a bazooka. So the idea was supposed to be, look, if we all make promises to give up certain things that we could normally do without law, like punish violations of our moral rights, then we've sort of put ourselves under an obligation to follow the authority, right? Now, the social contract that Locke thinks we arrived at, and this is right, goes like this. The state that we agree to and promise to abide by is a democratic state with substantive limits on what the state can legitimately enact. Now look at the Constitution. There are three things there that they have in common. I don't know if anybody actually makes this move, but this is clearly a moral argument that I'm making in favor of originalism. I don't think it works. Well, it doesn't matter. I don't think it works in a big way. First thing, Constitution has democratic decision-making procedures, like Locke wanted. Second thing, it has the substantive guarantees. Now, where does the contract come from? The ratification process, right? We made a deal. Everybody agreed. Now, what figures into this is another principle of fairness when it comes to interpreting contracts. Right? The contracts should be, it's a matter of fairness. Look, if you're going to construe you're a judge and you're going to construe a contract, you need to construe a contract in terms of the intentions of the parties to the contract. So, right, when you apply those, put those two ideas together, you get something like originalism, and that argument I gave is clearly morally normative. So I don't think anything in your comments, as far as I could tell, depends on that. And I'll bang originalism as hard as anybody. I think it's just, let me put it this way, I don't like it at all. But I did think it an important point to to observe that originalists have to believe in moral truth. Otherwise, they're not going to have any way of justifying their own theory. I mean, they would take themselves completely out of the legitimacy ballgame if they didn't. So I think that part of it is a mistaken. But then again, that's a very minor point.
Well, you certainly have covered a lot of ground. I think it's important to recognize that the interpretive debate is a limited debate. As I see it, at any rate, it's a limited debate, and it's important to keep our analytic categories intact. Now, just to give you one example, the interpretive debate is at its heart a debate about how to find out what the words of the Constitution mean. Okay? Now, you can expand it beyond that. You can also say the interpretive debate includes the further debate of what the Constitution is. I mean, what kind of norm the Constitution is, for example. But the core of the debate is how to find out what the words of the Constitution mean. Now, if we just leave that aside for a minute, let me just say this with you. I disagree with what you said about the Lockean nature of the founding. I think it's more complicated than that.
Oh, no, I was just giving an example of how one might put together something that looks like a moral argument in favor of an originalist theory. I wasn't claiming
but let me just go through it.
accuracy.
I also disagree with you that the Constitution is a contract. Now, your moral argument for originalism was premised on the Constitution as a contract. Even if the Constitution were a contract, I would disagree that originalism is that originalism, as I understand originalism. Now, the question now, therefore, is how should we understand originalism? That's essentially part of what part of Jim's theory, that the definition of originalism has become so inclusive that the concept has lost its cutting edge, its capacity to make distinctions. Yesterday, for example, Larry offered a definition of originalism in terms of two criteria, fixity and constraint. As he developed these criteria, that could include the moral reading. Now, if you just take a look at the core question of how to find out what the Constitution means, let's just take one example. Let's take the Due Process Clause. What does the Due Process Clause mean? Now, there are only several possibilities. As a matter of logic, there are only several core base possibilities. The words due process can refer to some real thing called due process itself. That's one possibility. We may reject that possibility, but that's one possibility. Or the words due process can refer to somebody's definition of due process itself. Whose definition? At this point, or at this level, it doesn't matter. It can be the framer's definition, it can be the judge's definition, it can be the people's definition at the time of ratification. The big point is somebody's definition of due process. Or it can refer, finally, to somebody's application or expected application of due process. So, due process itself, definition of due process, application of due process. Now, there can be variations on these things which amount to the same thing. For example, instead of talking about applications of what due process means, we might talk about examples of what due process means. The word example would be another way of stating application. All right? Now, what the originalists implicitly do is they deny that there is such a thing as due process itself. That's why they have to look either to somebody's definition. Now, that definition can be couched in different ways. You can talk, for example, about original public meaning. But the word due process can either refer to due process itself or some definition of due process or some application of due process. And the the election of originalists to go either with the definition or the application implies the rejection of the idea that due process refers to due process itself. Now, one more point.
Okay, but you'll give me a chance to...
Oh, yes, I will.
Okay.
One more point. The philosophic approach presupposes that the word due process refers to due process itself or something like it. Either to due process itself or something like it, and that this something exerts a normative influence on both our definitions and our applications, such that these definitions and applications can be wrong, and therefore imposes on us an obligation to self-critically strive to get it right. The originalists reject this and go for this, and therefore you can legitimately conclude that originalism is a flight from moral reality, or if you prefer, moral truth, to one or another form of convention. Now, your additional point, that originalists engage in moral reading, no question about it. Everybody engages in moral decisions. Everybody. The big difference is some people are aware of it and accept the responsibility that goes with it, and some people are not aware of it or pretend to deny it so that they can duck the responsibility that goes with it for reasons of their own. Okay? That's
Okay.
my
First,
answer to you. I'm sorry to take so long.
No. Everything you say is really fascinating. I disagree with just about everything you said, but I don't know. I'm not an originalist. But first, a clarification about what I was doing. I wasn't attributing that argument to anybody. I was just showing you how one might give a moral justification for originalism. You don't want to consider the ratification process a contract? Maybe I'd agree with you. But all I wanted to point out is that this kind of argument can be made, and it's a moral argument. So it was purely hypothetical. I was making no factual claims about what anybody has ever said. Now, here's the problem a second observation. I don't think, and the originalists in the room can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think the originalists are saying there's no such thing as real due process. I'd be real surprised if originalists ran around thinking, oh, there's no such thing as moral truth. I mean, otherwise, what do you want to teach your kids? Oh, okay.
You didn't listen to Larry's response yesterday.
Well, I wasn't. Was I here? I wasn't here yesterday.
You weren't here?
But let me just go ahead and finish my thought if I can recover it. Here's what I think they're doing. And I don't do work in this area. Okay, what they're saying is, look. Not that there's no objective truth about due process. It's just that it doesn't count in interpreting the Constitution because they argue that the thing that counts morally is public understanding at the time the relevant text was ratified, or framers' intention, or whatever. It's the moral justification above the reasons for thinking that originalism are true that justifies the claim that, look, there might very well be an objective truth about due process. It don't matter. What matters is, the original intent, whatever that turns out to be. My third point is this, and part of the problem here is, I guess I'm subscribing to a principle of charity, right? I try to interpret folks in the most charitable way possible. The way you put it then, if you're right, then how do they justify any claims about how to go about finding out what the Constitution means? What would be relevant? Factual? That doesn't seem to justify anything. Conceptual? That won't justify anything either. The only thing that's left is normative.
They don't, Ken. They have no argument.
Okay, I don't know. If I were an originalist, then I'd be making arguments. I can't speak for real originalists because I ain't one. But I don't know. May I turn this over to Larry then? Because did he fairly characterize your view on your view?
Well, I don't know exactly what Saad said.
The microphone, Larry.
I'm not sure exactly what Saad is saying. So I have positions in metaethics and moral philosophy. So I reject non-cognitivism in metaethics. I'm a cognitivist. I'm a naturalist of a particular form, right? The form of naturalism about morals that's associated with Philippa Foot and Michael Thompson, right? That means I believe in moral truth, right? And I'm a moral realist. And so my, argument from my own comprehensive moral and philosophical view would be an argument that would proceed from a general position in moral and political theory, right? Virtue ethics and virtue politics, the legal version of that, right? Which would be normative virtue jurisprudence, right? And then, I have arguments about the virtue of justice and so on, right? And so that's the kind of argument I would make from my own comprehensive doctrine. But I also think that those arguments are not necessarily the kinds of arguments that you need to persuade, to get people to affirm a constitutional approach to the Constitution in a pluralistic society, which we are in. People affirm a variety of comprehensive moral and philosophical and religious doctrines about the good. And so I agree with Rawls that under those circumstances, the appropriate kinds of justifications would flow from public reason, right? So you look for the kinds of reasons that are accessible to reasonable citizens, irrespective of their own comprehensive moral, religious, or philosophical doctrine about sort of ultimate moral questions. So that would be the kind of strategy that I would think would be the most appropriate kind of strategy to pursue the process of justifying originalism. I think it's manifestly not true that originalists don't offer moral arguments for originalism. So, there are lots of moral arguments made by different originalists. John McGinnis and Michael Rappaport have offered a straightforward consequentialist justification for originalism. I don't agree with that argument. I don't think that argument succeeds, but it's clearly a moral argument grounded in a comprehensive moral theory, right? They're act consequentialists, and they believe that they can show that adhering to the original meaning of the Constitution, which was adopted by supermajoritarian processes, is likely in the long run to lead to better consequences than are the alternative methods of interpreting the Constitution. So that's their argument. And Randy Barnett has an argument based on his theory of constitutional legitimacy. Ultimately, that theory is grounded in a position in moral and political philosophy, right? It's sort of it's his version of a Hayekian theory, and he and I sometimes disagree about what the roots are, but I think he ultimately sees it as also a particular kind of consequentialism. And there are other originalists who have other arguments for originalism. I think there's something fair, though, about what Saad said, which is that it's been fairly recently, like in the past decade or so, that originalists have recognized that they have to provide a normative justification. There are certainly originalists writing in an earlier period who said something like, this is just what interpretation must be, right? And so, you know, a couple of people have said that. Sai Prakash said something like that, for example. And I guess what I would say about them is that this is one of the reasons the interpretation construction distinction is valuable. They're making an argument about the nature of interpretation, right? The nature of what would...
Yes, conceptual argument.
And they're not making an argument about... That argument doesn't get you to construction. It doesn't tell you why the original meaning should constrain. And Gary Lawson is very explicit about this. So Gary Lawson says, look, I have a theory of interpretation I think I can justify really conceptually. He operates within the discourse of legal theory, not using philosophical terminology. He says, I can give you a justification for my view of interpretation, for what the Constitution means, right? And he offers those arguments. And then he says, I'm not a moral or political philosopher, and I would have to do moral or political philosophy to make a good enough argument as a scholar to persuade people that the meaning of the Constitution ought to bind us. I recognize that's the crucial question once you establish what the meaning is, but I'm not competent to do that. So he abstains, right? His own personal view is that there probably
Larry,
are
give me a
good
chance to
moral
respond before you run through the whole literature
So
of every
that
possible...
was where I'm going to stop. So that those are the kinds of positions that originalists take. And I think,
If I might quickly
therefore...
point out, Larry's a counterexample to your claim. At the very least, you're claiming that originalists don't believe.
No, actually, Larry is not a counterexample. You have to listen carefully to what Larry says. You have to, first of all, I insist that we keep our analytic categories separate and straight. Right, Larry? We got to keep our analytic categories separate and straight.
Of course.
All right. What you outlined as, first of all, you said, I'm a moral realist. I am an originalist, basically as a matter of strategy, because you have to persuade the public. Fine.
I didn't say that, and I object to that characterization.
No, I heard what you said. You want to rephrase what you said?
I said that I affirm originalism from my point of view, right, because I believe that that it flows from the best comprehensive theory of morality, and that in public justifications...
You didn't say that at first.
I disagree with that. I think you are again mischaracterizing me.
All right. I will simply have to await the argument. I mean, I can see the argument that says if you want to persuade Scalia, then you have to couch your arguments in an original way. But that's an argumentative strategy. That's not a strategy for finding out what the Constitution means. Now, that's not an argument for finding out what the Due Process Clause means. Now, as far as the other people that you described are concerned, I'm sure I misheard what you said. But this is what I heard what you said. This is what I heard you say. You said, in the case of Barnett, for example, and the other people that you mentioned, that they proceeded from certain moral premises to argue for originalism as a conclusion. For example, Barnett has a theory of liberty, and from this theory of liberty, he construes the founding in a certain way, perfectly fallacious. He construes the founding in a certain way, and then argues for originalism because his construction of the founding conforms to his conception of liberty. But he never examines his conception of liberty. Yes, he does have commitments. He does have commitments, and he reasons from those commitments. But one of the hallmarks of the philosophic approach is a keen sense of one's fallibility. And Barnett has no such sense, and you know it. And anyone who's ever read his book knows it. As far as his appeal to Hayek, are you telling me that Hayek is a moral realist?
I really feel I have to respond now. So perhaps you're not aware of it, but Randy has written a book of moral and political philosophy.
What book?
The Structure of Liberty. That book is all about the deep that's in the background of the project in restoring the lost Constitution. So
Well,
to say he
I
doesn't
have
examine his
read the lost
commitments
Constitution
when
very
you're not aware
carefully.
of his writings,
Yeah.
it seems to me, is highly irresponsible.
Barnett is a dogmatic libertarian who reasons from an unexamined Hayekian version of liberty. And I'm not a student of Hayek, but Hayek's, the one intellectual biographer of Hayek that I know of is Graham Walker. And I just have to appeal to him and say that I just have to examine this for myself. But Hayek is, according to Walker, a moral skeptic. Now, how he can advance a moral argument from a skeptical premises, God only knows, but he does.
Sorry to have started all this, but it's kind of fun.
Yeah, it is kind of fun.
So I want to point out that I think Larry has acknowledged that a lot, until the last decade, a lot of originalists did not acknowledge the need to make moral arguments for originalism. And I think Sa has very powerful criticisms of those versions of originalism. Now, in my book, the originalisms I focused on, your ecumenical account in general of originalism, I focused on your normative arguments for originalism. You made 3 normative arguments for originalism there. In my critique of McGinnis and Rappaport, I criticized their normative arguments for originalism. So I do want to make clear that in my critiques of the new versions of originalism, I did not flog the dead horse of the old originalism as question-begging, as tautological, and all the rest of it. And so I was, that was part of the portrait on the first 2 pages of your paper that I thought didn't recognize that. I focus mainly on new versions of originalism. I don't mean the new originalism because McGinnis and Rappaport are not new originalists, but I focus on new versions of originalism that face up to the need to make moral arguments for originalism. I engaged with those arguments. I argued that they were not persuasive as arguments for originalism. And so I think that we are at a point in the debate where the most thoughtful originalists do face up to that need. I don't think that you would find their arguments persuasive for their versions of I don't think you would find their moral arguments for their versions of originalism persuasive.
If you will check our, I don't remember the chapter of the book now, Constitutional Interpretation, the Basic Question. If you will check our chapter on the philosophic approach, you will see that we distinguish very clearly between the philosophic approach and the dogmatic application of philosophic teachings.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what Larry has described to me now is a reasoning from dogmatically held moral premises, a la Barnett's application of Hayek, and or a strategy for persuading Scalia, or those elements of the public that think like Scalia. The first one is not the philosophic approach as we understand it, which is keenly aware of one's fallibility and strive to make one's beliefs conform to a moral reality, a continuing process of reasoning, and it is also not a judicial strategy first you find out what the Constitution means, and then you see what you have to do to get as much of it as you can, given the people that you're trying to persuade. These are 2 different things. And I deny that it's possible for an originalist theory of meaning to be anything other than what we call abstract originalism, which is the philosophic approach. Larry is not an abstract originalist as he has described his position in response, especially in his response to Linda yesterday. And also in his response to me, where he claimed, for example, that he rejected Dworkin's distinction between concept and conceptions. If he rejects Dworkin's distinction between concepts and conceptions, he would certainly reject Michael Moore's distinction between opinions and reality, or an Aristotelian or Platonic distinction between opinion and reality. Now, he claims now to be a moral realist. Well, all I can say is that's news to me.
Who else is on the... Someone else? You want to say someone else?
If nobody else has a question, yeah, I'd like to make a quick observation.
And I can do one more.
Can I make one point about interpretive charity, Ken, before you get going? Because both you and Jim claim to be charitable interpreters.
I don't claim to be. I aspire to be. It's an aspirational thing.
Okay. There's a lot. There's a lot at stake here. There's a lot at stake here. And part of what's at stake here is offering intellectual legitimation to the likes of Antonin Scalia and Clarence Thomas and the present originalist on the bench. There's a lot at stake here. It's not an occasion for charitable interpretations, as far as I'm concerned. I'm sorry, Ken. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
Just a real quick observation. The argument that you just gave about persuading people, that was already inside the context of deciding a case. What I'm talking about is going outside the context of all cases to give a general sort of justification for using originalism as opposed to other theories of interpretation. If I haven't interpreted you charitably, or I'm interpreting someone uncharitably, I apologize, because I find that really offensive, and I never want to be guilty of that. Jim?
Emer, shall we wrap up?
Well,
Do you have a comment?
I think we can go till 11:45, because that wasn't like the program. And I still have a comment, but...
Right. Well, I would say this about your final point about interpretive charity. I'm not sure how I understand how being interpretively charitable to Jack Balkin, for example, interpreting him as embracing an abstract moral originalism, pointing out affinities between that and a moral reading, I'm not sure how that lends credibility to Scalia unless it's simply through the label of saying something good about somebody who calls himself an originalist. Okay? And so...
Can I explain?
But in my characterization of Balkin, what I argue is that he's best understood as a moral reader. So again, I'm not sure how that lends credibility to a radically different approach to originalism, which Balkin flogs very severely in his book. I mean, he's got among the most powerful critiques of Scalia's originalism I've seen.
By Balkin's own account of his position, he is a historicist.
Okay.
Not only that, but he says he's not a Hegelian.
Okay.
So he doesn't believe in something called the end of history.
Right.
That would give him, that would reconcile historical change to some kind of fixity of meaning, that he could claim as the object of his cognitive aspirations. So being a historicist and not being a Hegelian, that's what he says in his book, being a historicist and not being an Hegelian, he sees moral truth, or any kind of truth for that matter, he sees moral and or scientific truth as fundamentally changeable. Fundamentally changeable. there's an affinity between that general position of reality and Scalia's claim that we have to anchor our moral judgments in tradition. Both claim to be anchoring our moral judgments in kind of pervasive popular beliefs. So if the prevailing popular belief has an animus against gays and lesbians, that animus doesn't have to be anchored in any kind of moral truth, because there is no moral truth beyond the prevailing popular belief. That's Scalia's position in Lawrence versus Texas. Now, Balkin may think he criticizes Scalia, but Balkin doesn't criticize Scalia, because his deeper meta-ethics is on all fours with the meta-ethics of Antonin Scalia.
Linda, can you pass the microphone, Larry?
Sure.
So, Sot, I'm really upset with the tone of the last half hour or so, because, you know, I haven't read Larry's virtue ethics. I'm aware of it, but I haven't read it, and I can't speak to it. But Larry has told us that he has normative views, and he has philosophical views, and he's analogized to John Rawls's strategy of political liberalism about finding grounds for justification that don't require us to appeal to our comprehensive views. And so, and knowing Jim, I mean, Jim is basically a Rawlsian in that sense. And I'm also troubled a little bit because I think that I heard somebody say that you can't just say that's just what interpretation is, but I've read a lot of Dworkin, and there's parts of Dworkin where he just says, look, this is, what else could it be? You know, I mean, he's take you by the hand, chapter by chapter, 600 pages through Justice for Hedgehogs. He just tells you, you know. So I'm not really sure. In other words, I'm troubled. First of all, I don't want to end the conference on a really hostile note, because there has been a lot of constructive stuff that's come out of it. And if we haven't read Randy Barnett's book about his normative view of liberty, I don't see how we can say he's a dogmatist, right? You might still think that after you read the book, but we shouldn't prejudge, right, before we've read it. So I just want to make a plea for not, you know, going after, you know, people if we don't really know. But I am intrigued, though, about what Jim would say about, I mean, Assad, I guess as Jim, you know, do you really need to have, do you have some view about objective truth that drives your project? You know, are you lacking, and is that a weakness? And maybe Assad thinks that's a weakness, but do you think it's a weakness?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I think that...
Well, let me put it a different way. Are you not guilty of the things Sot says all these other people are guilty of? Like, do you have some view about moral reality, you know, that's underlying your vision or something?
Well, I think that one of the subtle differences between Sot and me is that Sot's a Platonist and I'm a Rawlsian, okay? And so in our book, Constitutional Interpretation of the Basic Questions, we
Finesse that. We
finesse that by doing things like, by saying things like, anytime Sot said something that sounded like moral truth, I said something that sounded Dworkinian about the best interpretation.
Yeah.
And so we finessed the disagreement between full-throated moral realism and a constitutional constructivism.
Now, let me tell you why that was a legitimate move on our part. If you go back to Dworkin's really seminal piece here, which certainly had a great influence on me, and I think Jim too, Dworkin says in his article, Constitutional Cases, that the moral reading, he didn't put it quite this way in that article, but this is a fair reconstruction of what he says, that the moral reading, quote unquote, presupposes a certain moral objectivity.
Right.
Now, from the inside, from the citizen's perspective, now, yesterday, Larry brought in Gailey and all of this, but Dworkin doesn't talk about this kind of thing in his article. The article was published not in an academic journal. The article was published in the New York Review of Books, addressed to the informed citizen, a reader of the New York Review of Books. From the internal perspective of someone who takes the law as written seriously, the presupposition is moral objectivity. Now, from an external metaethical perspective, someone could be a Rawlsian constructivist, or a Platonic or Socratic moral realist, or an Aristotelian moral realist, and still have the same internal perspective on constitutional interpretation. Now, having said that, at the end of the day, Jim and I will part company. And the reason we will part company is precisely over this agreement. Because my position will be something that Hart says somewhere in the Concept of Law, that something to the effect that affirming a proposition from the inside point of view presupposes that you can affirm it also from an outside point of view. In other words, your metaethics has to conform to your ethics. Your metaethics has to make your ethics possible. Now, in the case of a moral realist, this is where I think I have the advantage over Jim. My metaethics conforms to my ethics, whereas Jim's metaethics doesn't. But if what you're writing is a book on constitutional interpretation from the internal point of view, then you can bracket the metaethical disagreement.
Right. I always make the move that Rawls made in his famous article, The Independence of Moral Theory. I try to bracket those questions and make arguments about constitutional interpretation, the content of our constitutional commitments, without having to come down on a position on those larger philosophical questions. But I do appreciate Linda's effort to take this in a constructive vein at the end, although in doing so she's brought out the tension between Saab and me. but that's probably a good thing.
deflection. It's called deflection.
But that's probably a good thing. Right. 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 And again, I don't offer my book as an explication of Dworkin or a defense of Dworkin. It offers an approach that is, broadly speaking, compatible at the level of argument in American constitutional theory with Dworkin's. And so I think we can bracket the disagreements between moral reading and philosophic approach for purposes of this entry into the debate about arguments about constitutional interpretation and construction. Okay. So I think, shall we wrap up?
I still have one more comment, and then we can wrap. So let me just, and I think it comes into this line of not much into the difference, but now in the similarities and the connections. And actually, I have hearing both Larry Sager and probably Sott criticizing you for the idea of the imperfect constitution, and I more or less sided with you, saying that you can hold to that, to the idea of, because I think I got what you mean. But now that in your presentation you mentioned the idea of the relationship between morality and doing moral readings and being fallible. So I take that's part of the idea of the imperfect constitution. So my question to both of you, and I think you have to agree, is that if Jim changes imperfect for fallible constitution, would you be happy with that? But I think they can be used more or less as a synonymous here. So that's...
Well, It could be, though, that Sott's fallibility is fallibility concerning what is the perfect Constitution.
Well, you know, I've argued, I argued in 1984, I actually took the trouble to prove, I don't remember how I did it now, but I took the trouble to prove that conceptually there could be no such thing as a perfect Constitution. It's not imaginable. And so but the point I want to get to is Sager's point. I think if you unpack all that the Constitution says, especially with the lever of amendability is key, then you will arrive at a position where the only thing that you are fully and finally committed to is the one thing that a rational creature can't avoid, or at least can't voluntarily surrender, and that is the capacity to think for yourself about important questions. Now, you need to institutionalize this, and you need to cultivate this somehow. And I think that the only feasible, and even this is almost utopian, the only feasible way to do that is to have a certain kind of leadership community that enjoys the public trust. Madison says this in the Federalist 40. He attributes all significant constitutional change to this kind of agency, to this peculiar kind of agency. But he also says in the Federalist 49 that it ain't going to happen again. It happened at the founding because of the peculiar external pressures on the country at that time. But it's not going to happen again. And so that's the source of my pessimism, where you see a country drastically in need of constitutional change of a really fundamental sort. Emer mentioned the Electoral College, for example. I would mention the Electoral College and the Senate. There's no chance of that. I mean, there could be, I suppose, if a comet were to hit the Earth, but some kind of lightning, some kind of very, very destructive lightning would have to strike. And so, there's certainly no chance of that through normal or even extraordinary political processes. God might visit us with that blessing, but if there is no God to deliver us with that blessing, it ain't going to happen.
Okay. Well, okay.
Okay. Let me wrap. Do you want to say still something? Or can
I just want to say, not in response to that, I just want to say a couple words of thanks to you and to the commentators.
Okay, so I guess you go first.
Okay. So I want to once again express my appreciation to Emer for your incredibly generous and gracious hospitality in bringing us to your wonderful university and your splendid city. It has been a thoroughly enjoyable intellectual exchange and a thoroughly enjoyable sightseeing visit. It's been wonderful in every way. And I'm flattered and honored by the seriousness with which everyone has taken my book. And I am certain the book will benefit as a result of these criticisms. I couldn't have asked for a richer exchange concerning the book. So thank you so much for having us here to do this.
Well, I have one, like it was like kind of previous comment to the wrapping, but I guess it was better to do it this way. I feel kind of responsible if the tone went a little higher than what it was expected. But let me say something for the Mexican point of view, for the academics in Latin America. We are very soft, and we don't want to say anything that sounds even slightly on overtone. So actually, I think that, and sometimes I have to clarify that they are still friends. They are not going to hit each other. So that's something I would like to apologize, because I probably was my responsibility to lower it down. But somehow I think it's very nice to see these kind of exchanges. And to get a little of the overtone, and because it's important to see that there is difference if you hold this position, you hold this one, because it's not merely like I would say purely intellectual. I think it has also some sort of passion behind. But let me say something, because I think also Larry was pointing in his paper to the idea of the principle of charity, of the charitable interpretations. And I would just probably like to highlight these ideas as the keynotes for this kind of discussions. So Larry is saying the principle of clarity, the principle of charity, the principle of respect for identity claims, and of course the principle for kids, which is be nice and play well with others. And it goes into academic world, avoid pejorative characterizations and focus on arguments, not motives. So I think that's, I think we'll say that that's the part in which I think the methodology of these kind of discussions has to work. And I think it worked well. I think, I hope, and you already say that, but I hope you really benefit from all the discussion. And I will just close by saying that, of course, well, we are very also grateful that you are all interested in coming to Mexico and to do these kind of exchanges, and we learn a lot of you. And I still have the feeling that, as some of my colleagues pointed out, Roberto and Chisca at least, even though it sounds that it's very into the American Constitution, very parochial, we all benefit a lot on this, because, again, the arguments are universal. So these very same arguments we hear here, probably with different objectives or whatever, but then you can more or less map the positions around. So I think we all benefit from that. And I'm overdue by 1 minute, so I close now. Thank you again.